What I'm going to talk about tonight is three major areas. First of all, the timeline for treaty rights. What are treaty rights and how did we come to understand, how did they come to have the meaning that they have today? That's going to be sort of a chronological timeline. And a few people here on Orcas have heard some of this before. I'm not sure any of you are here tonight except maybe Joe Gatos. That follows a chronological timeline. I'm going to also talk about the risk to treaty rights today from the degradation and loss of the habitat that supports the resources that the treaty rights depend on, and what the tribes and others are doing about that to restore and protect that habitat, to bring back those resources so the risk to treaty rights gets reduced. The second things are not exactly in a sequential timeline. They're sort of mixed up in the second part, and you'll see that. I get a big laugh when I say what I'm about to say at the college classes, but I don't think this will be a problem for you. If treaty rights had a Facebook page, that's where they laugh. They go, "You old guy, we don't use that." If treaty rights had a Facebook page, the first point on the Facebook timeline would be about 15,000 years ago, when this area was covered with a sheet of ice a mile or more thick. And in fact, we were just talking about Antarctica at dinner tonight, and Gene mentioned that the people who go there, when they come back north, they love the smell of dirt. They love all the smells in the air. When you're in that ice land, which this land was, there are things happening, but things are pretty much at a standstill. And then when the ice retreated, the thinking is that the face of that glacier came here right through East Sound about 11,000 years ago. And as the ice retreated all the way up to the Canadian border, all of the land suddenly opened up, and the rivers were formed, and the bays that we have, like right here, were formed. And all the landforms were formed. And it was like a reset. It was like when I just had to send my tablet to Dallas to be fixed. It came back and it was reset. And it was missing everything, but I started populating it with apps and data and different things like that. And so I put together a new ecosystem on my tablet, and that's what happened here. The salmon moved in, the animals moved in, the plants moved in, and most importantly, at the same time, the people moved in, because there were people in North America then, and they all moved in at the same time. And Terry Williams, my former boss at Tulalip Tribes, is fond of saying we, and when he says we, he means native people. We're there in the rivers to watch the first salmon swim into the rivers. There's a paper in a scientific paper in the references that also talks about some of the changes that happened and how the salmon populated the rivers and how they changed their species identification and so forth. So the whole time, as we move along the timeline, the whole time that all of the rivers were changing and the bays were being formed and the plants and animals were moving, when the people were here adapting as the natural environment, adapting to the natural environment and developing a complex culture intertwined with that environment. As you know, the way of life of the people was based on a close association with the natural ecosystem. We hear people say, well, people are part of the ecosystem. You're darn right people are part of the ecosystem, and they really were. We are today part of the ecosystem, and they really were then. And the entire culture, religion, and way of life had to do with existing in the natural environment here. You know that thick forests covered most of the land around here, so a lot of transportation on rivers and bays was by water. Food harvesting was on the water. Canoes were everywhere. People said the water is our land to the arriving settlers who were more used to living on land back in Europe and farming. This photo that Randy Kinley of the Lummi Nation kindly provided me with is a picture of reef netting by the Lummi Nation in the 1940s, probably off of Lummi Island. You're probably familiar with reef netting as a really great non-Indian fishing method that's quite prevalent here in the San Juans as well as Lummi Island. But it's a method of fishing that was invented by the native people of this area, especially predecessors of the Lummi Nation, and even up to the 1940s, they were still doing it. Shellfish was a key part of the diet. The tribe said when the tide is out, our table is set, meaning that was their food right there. Salmon, though, were the key to the culture here. And the continued existence of the culture then and the continued existence today depends on a functioning ecosystem. That is what the entire culture is based on. So the next point in our timeline, does anybody remember the significance of the day, May 18th? Thank you. Most people don't speak up. Yeah, May 18th, 1980, Kathy and I were in our sailboat anchored off of Yellow Island, and we heard a big explosion at 8:30 in the morning. And it wasn't until we went to Stewart and where people were rafted up at the state park that evening that we found out that Mount St. Helens had erupted. Well, in 1792, quite a number of years before that, the people of this area had their lives disrupted to a much greater degree with the first contact from this guy right here, Lieutenant William Broughton, who was sailing a small ship for Captain Vancouver. He came up from the Olympic Peninsula through San Juan Channel, anchored at Flat Point, traded for live and deer meat at Blind Bay, probably went over to Orcas Landing, got an ice cream or something, I don't know. And there's a fascinating account of that in the references too, and it's really fun to read this stuff because they saw people everywhere in canoes. They saw native people just all over the place here. They went fishing and everything else. When I've talked about this before, people have said, you've got to talk about real first contact. Real first contact was with the smallpox virus, which probably hit this area around in the decade of the 1770s, not too long before Vancouver got here. If you read about it, which you can in one of the references in the list, smallpox spread throughout North America mostly by 1500 from Columbus, but it probably got here much later. Anyway, by the time Vancouver arrived in this area, nearly 1/3 of the population was killed from the disease, and villages were abandoned, and people were sick and disfigured from the disease, and it was really quite devastating to the people. So the next point in the timeline is January 22nd, 1855. Does anyone know what that day is? The date that the Treaty of Point Elliott was signed. Treaty of Point Elliott was signed somewhere down by Mukilteo. If you take the train by Mukilteo, you can see there's only a very small flat area there, so it probably confined to that area. The period after contact, before the treaty, was characterized by turmoil, more disease, great changes in the lives of the native people. U.S. became interested in this area, signed treaties with Spain, Russia, and Britain. So their interests were gone, and the only people remaining for them to sign treaties with were the native people who had already lived here and been here for 10,000 years. The gentleman pictured here is named Pat Canham. He's a so-called chief of the so-called Snoqualmie tribe. I say that because Isaac Stevens and the settlers really named the chiefs and named the tribes and delineated the tribes. But Pat Canham is the third signer of the Treaty of Point Elliott, the first one being Isaac Stevens, who was sent by the U.S. to make the treaties, the second one being Chief Sealth or Chief Seattle, and the third one being Pat Canham. He's buried at Tulalip, which is why I like to use him. People really need to understand that these treaties underwent, this treaty and the other similar ones underwent a long period of negotiations, at least a year, year and a half or more. You've heard about Chief Sealth or Chief Seattle's speech. That was part of the treaty negotiations in the area of Seattle in 1854. That's when there was a convening of the tribes to talk a little bit about the points in the treaty with Governor Stevens. When the date was announced for the signing of the treaty at Point Elliott, 2,300 native people from the entire Point Elliott treaty area, including up here and including Lummi and the mainland, went in their canoes down to Mukilteo. And something that I just learned in a book by Harriet Shelton Dover from Tulalip, a book that just came out and is on the list of references, is that the tribal people met for a week ahead of time to talk about the terms of the treaties, to talk about whether they were going to sign them or not. They had, much like the fisheries negotiations that go on nowadays. And the reason she knew that, she died in 1996 in her 90s, and the reason she knew that is her grandparents were there at the time of the treaty negotiations. So that's almost an eyewitness accounting, and it's really, really worth reading. They didn't have photography, though. This is from a reenactment of the Treaty of Point Elliott signing in the 1930s, in case you're interested. The Treaty of Point Elliott is only one of several treaties. The boundary lines are, the Treaty of Point Elliott goes from the Canadian border down to the environs of Seattle. We know that the San Juan Islands were not determined to be in the United States till a little bit after that, but includes the San Juan Islands now. And then the Medicine Creek treaties in the south, and the Quinault Treaty and the Point-No-Point Treaty and so on cover the peninsula. But the treaties all had similar language, and they were all done in a very short period of time. The Point-No-Point Treaty, if you can read the dates there, was done 4 days after the Treaty of Point Elliott. There's also a reference in there, I think, talking about that. What did these treaties say? You should pay attention to what these treaties say. I asked the lawyers, they're tribal lawyers, but lawyers are lawyers, right? And I assume there may be some in the room. I was told by the lawyer I asked that a full title search of your property or my property would lead back to this treaty, Treaty of Point Elliott. So your property is conditioned on this treaty, and so it's very important, I think, for us to understand what these say. Treaties are agreements. Like any agreement, each party gives up something and each party gets something. So from the point of view of the tribes, they gave up the title to all the land in the Point Elliott Treaty area, in this treaty. They gave up the right to make war on us, which I don't know, may or may not seem significant to you, but it was something the US was very interested in at the time. What did the tribes get? They got a few small reservations, and they have a few more now. They got small monetary payments over a finite period of time. And they got, this may have been one of the most important things to them, given that they were so devastated by disease and other factors. They got protection from the US government, protection against marauding tribes from the north, cannibalistic tribes. They got protection from the settlers too, from you and me. And that was important to the tribes. But here's the key point of this whole point, which is the tribes kept something in there. They didn't give it up, and they didn't get it. And that was a portion of their rights to fish, rights to hunt, and right to gather. I say a portion because actually, as you know, we non-tribal people have a right to fish, a right to hunt, and a right to gather as well. The tribes kept a portion of that. And what we call treaty rights are what the tribes kept in the treaties, not something they gave up, not something they got. So, there we go. And so what are those treaty rights? If you look at the treaties, the treaty rights go back to language. It's in, I think, Article 5 of every one of those treaties. They have the right to fish at usual and accustomed grounds and stations in common with all citizens of the territory, hunt and gather on open and unclaimed lands. There's other things in there that some people refer to as treaty rights, but these are key. And the historical record shows that the tribes, of course, would not sign the treaties without retaining the rights to fish and hunt and gather. But Governor Stevens was also interested in tribal fish sales to non-Indians, interested in providing for tribal self-sufficiency through their fishing. So both sides of this negotiation were very interested in having the tribes retain these rights. The treaties were signed in 1855. They were ratified by the Senate in 1859 and became the law of the land. The next point in our timeline is February 12th, 1974. Okay, well, who knows what February 12th is? I can't hear that. Yes. Thank you. So most of us in the room, when we were in school, Lincoln's birthday was still a day we got off. A few of you don't know what we're talking about. February 12th, 1974. What happened then? The Bolt decision was issued. I'm glad you're aware of that now. Okay, let me try one more. Who's that person pictured there? Billy Frank Jr., chair of the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission, great tribal leader for years and years, and had a lot to do with getting the Bolt decision decided the way, getting the Bolt, in the period leading up to the Bolt decision and the period after. Billy Frank was here on Orcas speaking at Deer Harbor at a salmon open house that Barbara Rosencotter put on about 5 years ago. I was fortunate to be there, and I hope some of you were too. And I hope you've been fortunate to hear Billy speak other times. It's always really inspiring. After the 1855 treaties were signed, U.S. Indian policy was all over the map. There's a few references actually that I provided, and it's fascinating reading if you want to read about it. And Harriet Shelton Dover's book really covers that period of time well. And the U.S. Government had changing ideas of how to treat the Indians. Assimilation really meant hop pickers working for slave wages in the Snoqualmie Valley, which is what that picture is. And then in the 1950s, they tried termination. Self-government in the 30s was when a lot of the current tribal governments were set up. It was a really a difficult period of time because there was no one consistent U.S. policy other than probably not doing what was best for the tribes. But throughout all this time, again, the record shows the tribal members, the tribes talked about treaty rights all the time. Fishing, hunting, gathering were key to their existence, key to what they were interested in. Some of the references just really go into that well. In the 1960s, early 1960s, Washington State developed a definite policy, official policy of not recognizing treaty rights. There were a number of reasons for this, a number of pressures on fishing. And as a result, enforcement by the Department of Fisheries and the Department of Game focused on tribal fisheries. Really, there was not a lot of management of other fisheries, but there was a lot of enforcement on tribal fisheries. There was a lot of response by the tribes with fish-ins and the tribes and their supporters. There's a book on the list of references called Messages from Frank's Landing that I think you're really going to want to read if you want to learn about this period of time. I got it in the mail at 8 o'clock one evening, and I think I went to bed about 2 a.m. that next morning after I finished it. It's really incredible, and I really recommend it. This is Billy Frank as a much younger man getting arrested. The first big arrest, his first arrest was 1945 when he was very young, but this, at Frank's Landing on the Nisqually River, there were all kinds of fish-ins and arrests. This is the Capitol Lake right across from the state capitol in Olympia in 1968. And then a few years after this, the fish wars turned violent at Puyallup when they were receiving a lot more attention. And the United States filed suit on behalf of the tribes to finally decide treaty rights because things were getting out of hand. So on February 12, 1974, the Bolt decision hit this area like a ton of bricks. I hadn't quite, it was a couple of years before I moved to Western Washington, but it was a pretty big deal. And I'm guessing to a few of the people in the room, probably it was a big deal when it happened. A lot of things, though, that people complain about or are concerned about in the Bolt decision were already law before the Bolt decision was decided. And I think it's really important to understand that. One of the handouts that I provided is a list of court cases if you want to read through the through the list of cases and show how many things were decided before the Bolt decision. It's actually worth reading the Bolt decision because he goes through that right at the beginning. It's very educational. The very first precedent cited in the Bolt decision is the U.S. Constitution. Article 6 says, all treaties made or which shall be made by the United States are the supreme law of the land. And this is the key part. And the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. I've read that so many times that I've got it memorized now. And it goes back to the U.S. Constitution. It goes through a whole series of cases. Three main things were new with the Bolt decision. One, the tribes already had a share of the resource. That was already well established in law. But people weren't able to manage with that. So Judge Bolt said, okay, 50% for the tribes, 50% for everybody else. He also defined usual and accustomed fishing areas. Remember that language from the treaty more precisely. And also had a lot to say about co-management authority and responsibility, how the tribes and the state share authority and responsibility for managing the resource. That was really my work for 26 years, and I'd love to come back and talk about that in detail, but that was a very important part of the Bolt decision. There we go. So since 1974, the tribes and the state have worked really well together finally on managing harvest of the resource, managing hatcheries, sharing data, sitting together at the table, sitting together and talking to the Canadians, where I just had a small job. I was up in Vancouver doing that last month. And recently, and rightfully, they celebrated the 40th anniversary of the Bolt decision last month. Billy Frank deserves a lot of the credit for how well things went in that regard in the past 40 years. And he's feeling pretty good right there, and he deserves it. And then, in addition, last week over at Swinomish, Billy celebrated his 83rd birthday. He's still going strong. He's the chair of the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission still, and still a great leader and still a great inspiration to a lot of people. But how, so we can switch now from our chronology of treaty rights and how we got here to see how we're doing with this resource now 40 years later. For that, I want to start with this graph, which I produced for, or there was something called the culvert case that I'll be talking about a little later, and this was something that I produced for that and was in the record, and it's simply a graph from 1974 to the early 2000s of the harvest. So this blue line here is the total salmon catch in the Bolt case area by the tribes. And this dashed red line is the total salmon catch in the Bolt case area by the non-Indians. And you can see that up until the mid-80s, the tribes were gearing up, getting ready to exercise the right that had finally been affirmed by the Bolt decision. And as a consequence, the non-Indian fishery was coming down. Everything hit a peak in 1986, and then I came to work for Tulalip. I just noticed that today. It's not very good. Well, we won't speak of that again either. But you can see that things were pretty much 50-50 after that, but also that the catches declined. And your first, and if I saw this out of the blue, my first reaction was, well, it's over harvest. They're catching too much. It's not over harvest. I don't have the time, or that's not my topic now, to explain that to you. I would actually love to come back and talk about harvest management and address that question more fully. But there's been a real, this is the decline due to the ability of the resource to produce itself and the loss of the habitat that produces this resource. All Puget Sound salmon, here's where I have to take a little bit of issue with the press release, and I hope you didn't come here for this reason, but the information that I have, I think it's fairly conservative, I think it's fairly accurate that all Puget Sound salmon have declined to about 1/4 to 1/8 of the original numbers that they were historically. It's hard to estimate that, but there's a paper by Gresh and Likatowicz in the references that, based on nutrients and things, I think documents that pretty well. We see numbers like 5%, 4 to 6%, and for sure we've lost some salmon runs completely, and other runs have declined a lot more than that. Certain spring Chinook runs are down 5 to 10% of their original numbers. That's for sure. But the resource that was here at the time the treaties were signed is much less than it was originally. And the other thing I need to say about this is you see this going up here on the right as we get to more recent years, and there have been some even further increases in catch after this, and that has a lot to do with better ability to target hatchery fish, produce and target hatchery fish while protecting wild fish. And it also has something to do with the large runs of pink salmon that have been coming back. And those are both really good things, but it doesn't solve the general problem of the loss of the salmon resource throughout the case area, which is of great concern to the tribes. I want to show a couple of examples, and there are many, many more, of the loss of habitat. I talked about loss of habitat amount, and I talked about loss of habitat quality. Let's talk about loss of habitat amount for a minute. This is a map of the mouth of the Snohomish River down by Everett. It compares some work from historical maps from 1870 with surveys from 1990. The different colors are different kinds of estuary habitat. Estuaries are where juvenile salmon, when they're coming out of the rivers, have to feed, store up energy to make that change they have to make to go into salt water and to grow so they can survive in the ocean. There was a huge amount of that habitat in 1870, much, much less in 1990. This kind of thing is documented in great detail for every single estuary in the Puget Sound area. We have estuary restoration started, which I'm going to talk about a little more in a minute, but we're continuing to lose estuary habitat on net. I just want to point out here that there are many studies that show it's not just a matter of saying we've lost that habitat. This is also a study from the Snohomish Estuary that was done by, authors are Andy Haas and Brian Collins. It's in the references, and this was sponsored by Snohomish County and the Tulalip tribes. And on the left is pre-development. It just shows potential for juvenile salmon to grow in the Snohomish Estuary. And on the right is with the loss of all that habitat, having that potential cut in half. Maybe in the questions we can discuss why you'd lose more than half the fish if you see half a loss of estuary habitat. But the point is, people are out there documenting that this kind of thing is a real problem. Doing all kinds of research on that now. So let's take a shoreline example from San Juan County. This is South Lopez. This is from the San Juan County Recovery Plan, what's called the Pulling It All Together project. And these maps are available for all the shorelines of San Juan County, but for a reason you'll see in a minute, this shows shoreline modification effects, and then this can be overlaid with where the salmon are. And both of those kinds of research have been done. And the one thing I want to point out here is the Barlow Bay and McKay Harbor, these beaches, are showing losses of shoreline function, and that translates to losses for the ability for the juvenile salmon and also the forage fish that salmon feed on to live there. Many of the rocky shorelines of the San Juans are not so modified, but the salmon work shows that these beaches, small beaches, are the places that are really important for juvenile salmon to feed on their way out to the ocean. So let me jump off of that into the first habitat restoration example. And I picked Barlow Bay on Lopez Island. This picture happens to be property owned by the Tulalip tribe. So near and dear to my heart, I did a little bit of work in conjunction with this. This is a dock, an old dock, a derelict dock on that property. And I don't know, in the early days when Kathy and I were living on San Juan Island, we had a sailboat. This bay, Barlow Bay, was full of fish processing plants and fish buyers, and it was a beehive of activity during the sockeye season. And every one of these docks and more had floats and buyers and fishing boats all tied up. But now, Tulalip bought this property, and frankly, they had ideas. Hey, maybe we'll do something with that dock someday, you know. But the decision was made to go a different direction because of the needs for beach restoration and salmon habitat, and because of the availability of funds from the DNR for creosote removal. So last year, instead of developing that dock into something, the dock, I don't know if anybody was over on Lopez and saw this. All I saw was this picture, but they came in, removed the dock, and we have now a beach there where there used to be a dock. So that's an example of restoration. People can go back now and say, hey, did that help? Are the fish using that area more? Is the improved process of that beach actually going to help the fish? I want to go back now to estuary restoration. I showed you about the loss of estuary habitat in really all of our estuaries going into Puget Sound. The tribes are working throughout the Sound on bringing back a lot of that estuary habitat, and it's a big deal. I've got the Nisqually up here, but all throughout the Skagit Delta, Wiley Slough, for example, is a place that some people might go duck hunting. That's all been flooded. That's a big estuary restoration project that the Skagit tribes are doing. Tulalip tribes are doing Quileute in the Snohomish Delta right by the city of Marysville. And if you drive to Olympia, it's in America, it's the capital of America. Anyway, it's the capital of Washington. And I-5, this is I-5 right here. And I've been driving that for 40 years, many years, and recently you notice the water on this side coming up to I-5, and you might say, hey, sea level rise in action. Well, I don't think sea level rise is happening quite that fast, but estuary restoration is happening there. The Nooksack Wildlife Refuge here, which the Nisqually Wildlife Refuge, which the Nisqually tribe has been working on since the early 70s, was recently, past few years, flooded. And over here is something called Brown's Farm, which was just recently flooded in the past few years. And those involve taking out the dikes that were there, well, first building new dikes back farther, and then taking out the other ones and letting the water come in and letting that estuary function like an estuary again. This is what Brown's Farm looks like from the air. This is really cool because we, I was on a committee called the Technical Recovery Team, and later the RIT, Recovery Implementation Technical Team, working on salmon recovery throughout Puget Sound. And we toured this farm before this project was implemented. And now it's been implemented, and you can see it when you drive by on I-5. And I spoke the other day with Chris Ellings, the tribal biologist for the Nisqually tribe. And I said, yeah, I've heard rumors that fish are using that farm as soon as you opened it up. And he said, yep, it's really true. We're seeing fish everywhere using these habitats. So that's a good thing, because some of us who worked on salmon recovery told people that's where you need to put your money, that's where you need to put your hundreds of millions of dollars, and it's a good thing that it seems to be working, because we just did that with computer models. I want to say we hear a lot that you're spending all these hundreds of millions of dollars on salmon recovery, and we're not seeing any results. Well, a couple of thoughts about estuary restoration. Takes a long time to get these projects implemented. I think this one is probably the farthest along, and it's really been underway for a long time, long before Puget Sound got into salmon recovery in a big way. And once a project is implemented, it takes a while for the habitats to come back and all the plants to grow and all the things that grow in an estuary originally. And once that happens, it takes a while for the fish to grow, go out to sea, survive in larger numbers, and start to rebuild the population. So I think we need a little patience when we hear that, because I think these projects are going to produce a lot for us. Back to Skagit for a minute and some of those projects. I asked Eric Beamer from works for the Skagit tribes, give me some information on how you're documenting, how you're deciding that your projects are working. And this is monitoring information from some of the Skagit projects. And again, we're not going to go into this in detail, but if this blue line, this says traditional tide gates here. If you have a tide gate, you get very little production, and if you compare it, that's what the red one is, with a nearby habitat that doesn't have a tide gate. Your tide gate habitat is just not producing fish. This is self-regulating tide gates, which is a fix that, according to this monitoring, doesn't work that well. Digging out the estuary, but setting back dikes, which are these projects I was just talking about. They go out and they measure and they say, wow, we're getting a lot more fish there than in a similar area where it's just natural. So the point is that there is a lot of monitoring. I've got references under the restoration section in the references where you could actually look up the monitoring that's being done for every one of these estuary restoration projects, because people really are looking into it. The tribes are doing a lot of other restoration work with many partners throughout Puget Sound. Engineer log jams, that's the Jamestown Sklallam tribe in the upper left there, but you may have seen engineered log jams. That is putting wood into the rivers because we don't have big trees anymore to go down into the rivers and make natural log jams, and you may have seen a lot of those on the North Fork Nooksack if you've gone that way up skiing on Mount Baker, and they're all over Stillaguamish, Snohomish, and many other rivers around. Upper right is youth from the Lummi Nation planting natural vegetation along stream banks, and again, that's happening in many watersheds, and the tribes are participating in a big way. Perhaps the greatest thing that's happening right now in salmon recovery, in which I'm only spending 30 seconds on, is the removal of the 2 dams in the Elwha River. It's an amazing story, and probably a number of you have been following it. And the Lower Elwha Clallam tribe is not only instrumental in the work that's going on, deciding what to happen, doing the restoration, doing the vegetation restoration, but they originally proposed back in the 1960s that those dams should be removed. So that is so exciting. We can't wait to see what happens when those fish, those 100-pound king salmon, start coming back. I want to talk a little bit about degradation, or loss of the quality of habitat, and I could talk about all kinds of stuff in rivers and streams and everything, but I'm going to, because we're here on Orcas, because this is sponsored by CDOC, I'm going to talk just a little bit about the marine environment, the saltwater environment, because salmon live in freshwater, salmon live in saltwater. So the first thing is these graphs from the Salish Sea Marine Survival Project, which is a Canadian and US project to understand why this is happening. For coho, chinook, and steelhead, we're losing the fraction of the fish going out of the rivers that come back as adults is declining. We have red lines showing Strait of Georgia, blue lines showing Puget Sound. Those are the two components of the Salish Sea, and we're losing survival for all these species everywhere. If you look at the Columbia River, if you look at the outer coast, we're not seeing that. So there's something going on here that's a problem. There's a project now to try to understand what that is. I'm mentioning the recent problems in Bellingham Bay because that was recently highlighted in a CDOC post, which I found to be really interesting. You go back, they monitored Bellingham Bay in 1996, 2004, 2010. 2010, there were many fewer species of little critters living in the mud. Not only that, but they were mostly worms, and there weren't any pea crabs and weren't any amphipods. Well, if you look at long lists of what salmon eat in salt water, there's a ton of stuff on there. Crustaceans, amphipods, copepods, pteropods, which I'm about to talk about. Worms aren't on that list. So this kind of thing is the kind of thing that could be a real problem for our salmon survival. What are the causes of those problems in Bellingham Bay? There's a number of causes that have been given. These things are cool because there's a program at Shannon Point Marine Lab sponsored by Western Washington where community college students do internships, and one of the things they're doing is mapping. That's a red blob on the right and the purple blob on the left are the anoxic zones, the big blobs of water that don't have any oxygen in, and that basically stresses the organisms out and causes all worms and no smiley crabs. And these community college students are doing this work, and it's really, really fascinating to read about it. And I get really jazzed to think that these young people are gonna really help us figure this stuff out. And another cause of the Bellingham Bay problems and our salmon problems in general is ocean acidification. Worldwide and locally, it's a very clear relationship between increased carbon dioxide in the water and decreased pH, meaning higher acidity. Some fairly simple chemistry, although I don't know, I might have not done too well when I had it on the test in school, but it has to do with the carbonate-bicarbonate relationship. And if you're on the first one, carbonate, your critters that have shells can make shells. They can take calcium and make shells. And when you go the other way, when you get more acidic ocean, they can't make shells anymore. And we're starting to see effects of this all over the place now. We're seeing it especially with shellfish growing operations in the Salish Sea. And this one up on Vancouver Island, Qualicum, was just publicized within the past couple of weeks that a scallop growing operation had to close, and they think it's because of increasing acidification. And last night, Maria Cantwell spoke eloquently. I think she spoke eloquently. I didn't stay up to listen to her, but the senators last night stayed up all night to talk about climate change. And I was glad to hear that Maria Cantwell chose to talk about ocean acidification, because that's the clearest effect to me, and really one of the most concerning ones of increasing CO2 in the atmosphere. And Maria Cantwell was very concerned about effects on Washington industry, shellfish growing industry and other fishing industries. And it's relevant to salmon in a big way because one of the foods of salmon in salt water are pteropods. There are many different species of pteropods. In fact, they're called sea butterflies because some of them have two little shells and they look like a butterfly. They're about the size of a small pea. And juvenile salmon eat these all over the place, wherever they are. And there's really good research to show that increasing ocean acidification due to increasing carbon dioxide in the water is causing a decline in the population of primary food organisms for salmon, such as these guys. There's information in the references on the governor's Blue Ribbon panel that finished their work about a year ago, put out a report with stating the problems with ocean acidification really clearly and recommendations for what can be done about it. Terry Williams from the Tulalip tribes and Micah McCarty from the Makah Nation We're 2 members of that small panel. The tribes are interested in this stuff in a big way, and we all should be interested too. Salish Sea, Marine Survival Project that's looking at all of these things. The tribes are on the leadership board of that project, and again, that is something where we're trying to figure out what to do about this one aspect of habitat degradation. So I want to switch to one more area here, which is that I've talked about how the tribes and the state and other partners often, usually these days, work really well together, really cooperate. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they don't agree. And the recent culvert case is a case in point. And I think it's important to understand that well, I'll talk about the issue first. Culverts are pipes that take water under the roads. So when you go over a stream, one way to cross that stream is put the water in a pipe, and it goes under the road. But often they're designed so fish can't get up there. So you've cut off maybe miles of habitat, maybe a short amount, maybe miles and miles. There's a way to fix it. There's several ways to fix it. One way is to build a bridge. Bridges cost money. On average, the culvert fixes cost $300,000 for each one. You have one on Orcas that isn't even part of this case because it isn't a state road, Cascade Creek going into Buck Bay. I asked Barbara Rosencotter the other day, that one cost $800,000. So it's not cheap, but the law and the court decisions, and you could look in that list of the ones after the Bolt decision, say that the state has an obligation to provide habitat to produce the fish that were agreed to in the treaties. We'll link back to those treaties. So that whole habitat case has a rough history, but what ended up happening is the tribes went to court and said, look, you're blocking habitat, you're trying to fix these culverts, but you're not doing it fast enough. I was a witness in that case, and a third of my testimony was thrown out for technical reasons, and I said, oh my God, I'm going to be the cause of losing this thing. But really, it didn't matter. The tribes won everything in that case because the judge was convinced. And that's in your list of cases, and I would read that. It's very, very clear there, and I think very important for people to understand what the habitat obligation means, because this is a very clear-cut case. Either the fish can use the habitat or they can't. So now the state is required by the court to fix about 800 culverts over 17 years at a cost of $2 billion. That sounds like a lot of money. I want to point out that Representative Hans Dunshee said, and he was right, that the culvert case was a lot like the state Supreme Court decision that told the state of Washington they need to get their act together with education. That's going to cost $1 billion per biennium forever, or something like that. It's going to cost a little more. So these are real issues that matter. They're real obligations, and they go back to the treaties. So the tribes have had great success working cooperatively with the state in managing harvest and fair allocation, 50-50 harvest, managing hatcheries, working together on, some environmental initiatives, some Puget Sound cleanup and so forth. But the loss of habitat is still continuing, and the tribes have not been seeing that headed in the right direction. So in July 2011, that's almost 3 years ago now, the tribes put together this Treaty Rights at Risk white paper, took it to Washington, D.C., because the federal government is the protector of treaty rights. And they said, federal government, we're working on all these areas, we're improving management of these resources, but we're continuing to lose the quantity and quality of habitat required to maintain the resources that we were guaranteed, that we kept in the treaties. Estuaries, marine conditions, and blocking culverts are just 3 of many, many examples cited in this report. I certainly recommend that you read it. We're losing forest cover. We're getting more and more non-permeable surfaces that totally change the environment for salmon. Still losing large wood and streams. Many other, we're losing estuary habitat over here as we restore it over here. And the tribes have documented many of these things in something called the State of Our Watersheds report, which is also in the references. So if you're interested in seeing what the tribes are saying about this issue, I really urge you to look at those things. They're asking the federal government to take the lead. They're following up now with the federal government. The administration did tell the regional directors of the federal natural resource agencies that they need to pay serious attention to this, and they are to some degree. I still sense some frustration. I keep in touch with folks from the tribes pretty closely. The day after, last month, they celebrated the 40th anniversary of the Bolt decision on February 5th, a week early. And on February 6th, the day after that, they held an all-day panel to discuss treaty rights at risk and where things were working and where things weren't moving, and really what to do about that. This is very serious to the tribes. So I'm getting to the point where I need to give you the answer to solve all these problems. I got a little depressed going through this last part. So I thought, hey, I know you've all seen this picture, but hey, maybe that'll make you smile. Because I don't have the answer. This is a complex situation. And it's something that people like you, I'm glad you're here to understand the layout of the issues and some of the things you could delve into more. I know a lot of people here do a lot of work to advance environmental causes, support environmental groups, maybe work out at the Marine Health Observatory right here, maybe beach watchers, maybe MRC, all those things are important. But we're still not quite there. We hear complaints a lot. I hear them. I'm sensitive to these. That the emphasis is too much on salmon and not enough on people. All you care about is salmon. I beg to differ with that. I think especially in our region, the salmon have to deal with people a lot. And I think this picture illustrates that really well. And you've probably seen this. It's pretty well known. It's been around for more than 10 years. Did you notice, though, that this guy crossing the road has friends all here waiting to cross this road, too, in the flood? So we're still seeking the right balance between the salmon resource and the needs of people. And we're not quite there yet. And I would suggest, see these words again. We know we're just about at the end. I would suggest that we look to the people who have been here for 10,000 years, and for many of those years did coexist with the salmon. There's a lot of traditional knowledge, a lot of thinking, a lot of ways of living that probably have a lot to do with how we could coexist with the salmon. So we need to be open to all voices and keep the discussion going with everybody. This is a mask that hangs in Kathy's in my living room. It was given to us by, wasn't given, it was made for us by Kelly Moses, a Tulalip tribal member and fisherman and artist. It depicts this calling back the salmon spirit, which is a song from the Tulalip tribe's first salmon ceremony, which sort of is about this time of year this time of year that we're at right now, when resources are low, people maybe even in this land of abundance are probably getting hungry, and those first salmon may be coming back soon to bring back the promise of the renewal of the cycle and more food for the people. Life can go on. This is why religion and environment and culture were so closely entwined. And some of us think about this also as sort of the cycle of time that we're in. The salmon are down, and we're hoping we can call back the salmon spirit by working together and bringing back the salmon using both our science and our culture, but maybe some traditional knowledge too. All this was described to me on a piece of paper that Kelly talked to me about it, and then he wrote it all down on a piece of paper so I wouldn't forget it. And I want to conclude here with some words that he concluded with on the piece of paper. And he said, this piece pays respect to the men and women that work tirelessly on preserving salmon runs for future generations to come, and their dedication to the people in our fishing community. Our hands are up to you, Osaya. And I know that, as I said, many of you do a lot of work to protect and restore the resources that we all depend on and that the tribes depend on. So I hope you take those words as a thank you for the work that you do, and an invitation for all of us to work together to solve these problems. So thanks for listening.